My name is Andy. I represent the Montana Book Festival. Thank you for coming today to Outward Exploration as Self-Exploration. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce you to John Fraley and John Messick. I'm going to start off with a little biography for Mr. Fraley. John Fraley came to Montana as a teenager and received fish and wildlife management degrees from both Montana universities. He retired after a 40-year career with Montana's Wildlife Agency, mostly spent in northwest Montana's Flathead Country. John wrote regularly for Montana Outdoors, and he has written articles on the Flathead's history and other topics for True West Montana, the magazine of Western history, Western Wildlands, Wild Outdoor World, and other magazines. John's other books include Wild River Pioneers, Rangers, Trappers, and Trailblazers, A Woman's Way West, and Heroes of the Bob Marshall Wilderness. He lives with his wife, Dana, in Kalispell. John Messick is a writer, teacher, and father who has worked building hiking trails, fighting wildland fire, and shoveling snow in Antarctica. Since moving to Alaska in 2010, he has lived in Fairbanks, Homer, Ketchikan, Soldotna, where he still lives with his spouse, Molly, and their 2 children, and a pair of aging sled dogs. He currently serves as an assistant professor of writing at Kenai Peninsula College, where he teaches composition and creative writing. Can we get a little round of applause for our authors? So we're going to have a little bit of an open session with John and John today. We're inviting all of you to participate in asking questions. We only have 2 microphones, so as we get started today, if you have a question, please raise your hand. I'll bring the microphone to you, then we'll pass it back to the authors. I'd like to start off with a question for both of you, if that's all right. We were talking in the hallway about all the ways your perspectives on nature are similar. I was wondering if you could give the audience a little introduction to what exactly your perspective is and the common ground you've found already in your brief conversations getting to know each other here at the festival.
Test. Is it going through? Okay. Well, that's an interesting question, and John and I we've had about the last hour maybe to chat a little bit about our perspectives, and we have a lot in common. I think we both look at nature in a spiritual way. That's my impression. And that's the big thing I saw. I haven't read all of his book yet, Compass Lines, but I see a lot of those similarities. And I think that I've, in my 50 years now, throughout the Bob Marshall Wilderness and other backcountry areas and so on, I just feel that there's a real spiritual component to the backcountry landscape. I believe the people that have spent a lot of time there have old timers, and then, of course, in previous millennia, have left their DNA and their elements in that area. And that's got to, physically there, it's got to translate into them being there spiritually, in my opinion. I always try to argue that with people, and I get various debates going. But that would be how I would start.
Yeah, I think a lot of the way I define, and it's interesting that you use the word nature, and I think that's an important distinction between nature and wilderness. When I started writing Compass Lines, I was pretty young. It was not called Compass Lines. It was imagined as a collection of travel writing, and I would have defined the wilderness elements of this book very differently. My role in them would have been very different as a younger guy with no kids, who really was traveling the world and saw this idea of movement through a landscape as the best way to see a place. I saw nature as something kind of apart from us, something you seek out, something you go to, since becoming a father. And that shows up in the later sections. One thing I've learned is that there's always nature. This definition that we have of wilderness is very much a contemporary definition. It's a definition born out of the modern structure of our society, and as such, like we need wilderness we need that modern definition because of the threats to land. But I think wildness is maybe a better way to phrase that. And the other thing is that nature is all over. I was just telling you earlier, I have a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old, and we took them out canoeing a couple weekends ago. And I'm imagining that they're going to be super excited about getting out and seeing loons, and the loons are getting ready to migrate now. And, we paddled a couple of lakes back into a wilderness area, and we did some portaging, and, it was just a long day trip to get out into this area. And at the end of the day, we're back home and we're tired. And what was the best part of all of this adventure? Was it seeing the swans? Was it the moose that came down to the water? And I loved playing with the caterpillar. And that's nature, right? That's nature as well, is that both the small and the big things. So it's a reminder that one doesn't have to go to the most intense location, to the most remote locale to find things that fill us with wonder. And that's changed for me, I think, in recent years. That said, I still absolutely love that sense of wildness and that locale. I have a firm belief that the last chapter of my book is about a month and a half that my wife and I got to spend up in we call it the Chugach Fairyland in Wrangell St. Elias National Park. We were caretakers at an old mining camp for 6 weeks. And that's about the whole summer, is that 6-week period. And we were above tree line up in the Alpine, 70 miles we were flown into an airstrip 70 miles from the nearest thing you might even come close to calling a road, in a pretty inaccessible valley that, not very many people visit. There's just an old airstrip there. And I think that landscape, played a major role in the development of my child, my son, in Molly's belly. And it, plays a major role in how he exists. So I think there's a lot of reciprocity between the way we interact with the land and how it lingers in us, and vice versa.
How might your perspectives on this relationship between humans and the wilderness differ? We've seen a little bit that you guys have a spiritual connection. Have you guys found any differences between your approach to the wilderness or how you interact with it?
Well, I would first of all comment on one thing that John said about wilderness is a fairly recent designation. And wilderness, wildness, there's lots of definitions for each one. And when I think of wilderness with the big W, an actual designated wilderness, I've spent a lot of my time there because it's necessary to have those modern connotations for it to still be wilderness. If you don't have those connotations, you're not going to have what you would think of as wilderness. And so that's important. And then I think talking about, spending time with your children in the wilderness, that's my daughter right there, just walked in, Heather. That is very important. And it puts a perspective on you of timelessness, I guess. But and then you also mentioned like the spiritual aspect. I'm hoping to get into that a little bit about, how many of you in here have had some sort of like an odd experience or a supernatural experience in wilderness or the backcountry? Anybody? Okay, good. I've had a bunch of them, actually. I'm almost scared about it. And then one other thing I wanted to mention about your question there is a lot of times people that have grown up, people our parents' age, or let's say people that have recently passed away, they don't look at wilderness the same way we do. A lot of them look at it in a more utilitarian way. It's something to use and that kind of thing. And I wanted to bring that up. This is part 2. I'm jumping ahead, John, sorry, but I wanted to bring up the reason I got started writing. And my first book was called A Woman's Way West. And the main person in the book is Doris Huffine. And she died 30 years ago at age 90. She was one of the pioneers in Glacier National Park. And she taught me that her life was very important in terms of the history of Glacier. And it got me started. That was my first book. And now I'm up through 5 books. And what I'm trying to do is bring the people up In fact, like one of the Forest Service rangers, Henry Thole, in my book, in a couple of my books, most Forest Service employees right now don't even know who Henry Thole is. And he was the greatest ranger to ever set foot in the Bob, in my opinion. And so it disappears. It goes away. So how do you keep it? You know. And I just wanted to mention getting journals is huge as far as getting journals that have been written and lost. In my books, I've done 3 different lost journals. And one of them was like a found journal from Doris. When Doris passed away, her sister Maxine worked with me on this biography and gave me all of her journals from 1924 to 1979. So here I had all these journals from this woman who I loved very much and respected. And I wanted to tell you what she said about one thing. So in 1979, I met Doris when we were heading up to Glacier Park with my wife, now my wife Dana. And Dana was Doris's great aunt. And we talked, and first it just exploded. We had these big arguments about grizzly bears because she had cooked for going to the Sun Road survey crew, and they just threw their garbage out in the woods. And she said that was what happened. That's what kept the bears away from our camp. And I said, Doris, you can't do that. You're just food conditioning those animals. He says, oh, you don't know anything, you know. And so that was the first day I met her. And so that was 1979. And then we moved to her town the very next year. And so I have her journals, right? So I have things that she wrote about me in her journals. And so I'm reading this one about, I wonder if she wrote anything about that first day we had that argument. And I looked it up. It was like, whatever, August 1979. And it said, Dana's here with her boyfriend. And she said, little guy, blowy like a banny rooster. That's what she said. And she also said, doesn't appeal to me. And then about, like a couple years later in her journals was like, well, John does help us. He just helps us around the place. Because at that time she was in her 70s and she had to manage all these people to help her do stuff. And so he's not too bad. And then the next time I found it was John is real nice. We got used to each other. And I had access to all these wonderful journals, you know, and that was just one example of how I got into the writing and how the human person touches you and inspires you to write more about the places, even though she was all over the wilderness and she owned places that were entryways into Great Bear Wilderness too. But she didn't look at wilderness the same way. She loved the outdoors, but she was a little bit more utilitarian in her progress of it. Oh, go ahead, Beth. Sorry to go on.
Yeah, I highlighted a section in your book when I was reading it, actually, about that, the idea of collective memory and the way that collective memory is something we need to understand that landscape. And as fewer and fewer people are able to share that collective memory, you start to lose a particular kind of sense of place. And I think for me, that's one of the things that drew me to Alaska. I grew up in Wisconsin, and the collective memory of the landscape of the area I grew up in goes back to farm fields. And that is not the original landscape of the place where I grew up. That landscape is gone. The landscape of far north woods, endless red pine, those forests were cut down, and the memory of what that landscape was like, it's not there. And that's across, most of the Midwest and Michigan, into Minnesota as well. You go into the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness, which as a kid, that was the ultimate wilderness experience in the region where I grew up. And you see what appears to be untouched, but what is actually leveled. They cut down all but, a handful of acres across a swath of the north that you'll never get back. It's gone. And when you go to Alaska or you go to the far north, for me at least, suddenly I was seeing a landscape that really did feel untouched. And I think that's also incorrect. I think it's taken me a long time to learn that. And I have this journal entry from my first trip north, which was, I was 24, 25, and a friend and I, we'd been fighting fires, and we concocted this fairly bad idea in the back of the buggy one day at a fire somewhere. We were looking at a map on a slow day, and we found a really big river going to the Arctic Ocean. And we said, we should paddle that. And it was not the Yukon, because everybody knows the Yukon. So we paddled the McKenzie River, which neither of us had ever heard. And we drove up for a week up to Fort Nelson. We bought a canoe off the classified ads in Minneapolis, plunked it in the water. We had no plan of how we were going to get this canoe out of there, how we were going to get back once we got to the Arctic Ocean, and just floated for 2 months down this river from the closest road access point to get on the McKenzie River. And it's about 1,800 miles of waterway. And we had this moment where there are a handful of villages in that area. We're up in the Northwest Territories. And we had this moment between two villages where we were probably about 80 river miles downstream from one village and another probably 80 river miles before we would hit the next river village. It's just this huge distances. And does anyone care if I read a small section of this? So I thought this fits with this idea of how landscape evolves and how people connect with landscape, how listening to elders, to the older people who know it, can teach us something. So only now in marriage and fatherhood have I realized how floating the McKenzie River nurtured an essential element of my inner self. By balancing my daily life with the rhythm of seasons, I was becoming attuned to place. One day, 3 men motored up to the gravel bar where Wade is the guy I rode with, were eating lunch. They asked if we'd seen any moose. We hadn't. They saw our shotguns, which we kept for bears, and asked if we'd seen any ducks. A flock happened to be floating past. 2 younger men jumped back into their boat. "Come on," they said, and I grabbed the shotgun and followed. They positioned me in the bow, revved the motor, and shouted, "Shoot," as the birds rose from the water. I fired round after round, and we chased the flock up and down the river, motor roaring, until we had 3 birds in the boat. "It's easier this way," said one of the men, explaining the not exactly ethical or legal technique. Back on shore, the old hunter shook his head and smiled. And he said, "Now we don't have enough gas to go back upstream to our village," and added that they hadn't brought much food or gear since they'd only planned to be out for the day. The thought that they suddenly had no way home floored me. It was another 150 miles to the next downstream settlement. Wade and I wouldn't make it there for almost a week, yet the old man seemed nonchalant. Wade asked if he was worried about having to walk home. He shrugged and pointed to a forest that stretched unbroken to the Atlantic Ocean. He was already home. And that's an idea that blew me away for years until I met Alan Boris, who was a professor and worked at the college with me and was an elder. And he said, there's this idea of how we're connected to place. Home is not the village. Home is this huge area that surrounds it. Home is the entire forest within Dene context. And that idea of being home, being attuned to a place, that takes years to understand, to live with a kind of nonchalance toward, hey, here's where you're at. There's a difference between being nonchalant in a stupid way and nonchalant in a known and elder way. Like, one can be nonchalant and go out and with a bag of rice to a bus, and things won't probably turn out so well with that famous story. Infamous story, I suppose. But one can go out into the forest, go out and be very, very far out and do just fine if you have a particular kind of knowledge and also, I think, a particular kind of worldview. So.
John, I really want to follow up on this idea of collective memory. Really fascinated by how you put that. How do these sort of forgotten physical landscapes that you've encountered help you explore the human emotional landscape? And is that similar to the collective memory that you brought up?
Sure, yeah. All right. Yeah, I mean, I think the emotional landscape, and I'll turn to what we were talking about just before this. In the Dena'ina worldview, this was something I learned from Alan Boris as well, and he's written about extensively, which I referenced briefly. There's this idea of begesh and begesha, which are essentially it means essence or spirit, and there is begesh and begesha, and there is how you behave in an environment, how you feel when you're doing things, is it changes your luck. And luck as a living, evolving result of the behaviors that you practice on a daily life, and not like what happens at a casino. Luck then is how you feel when you go into a space. And I think that's an idea that I try to embody in part because the more I live in Alaska, the more I realize how important it is for me as a white person being new to a place with a history of a landscape where we're talking about old timers, at least in the town where I grow up. The folks we call old timers are old. Many of them are gone. That collective memory is starting to go away, but it was in 1950 Dena'ina land, and where Soldotna's Fred Meyer's parking lot was a homestead, and the woman who homesteaded there, Marge Mullen, is still kicking. She came to my reading a few weeks back, which was pretty cool. And as you lose those things, I think privileging knowledge that has always been there, that goes back a very, very long time. That is first occupancy knowledge that goes back to before the old timers. That's a knowledge that is handed down, that comes orally. And I think it's important as a non-Indigenous person for me to try to listen. So when I talk about Begasha or talk about that inner landscape, I think it's important for me to feel conflicted about how I interact with the landscape, kind of at all times, even if I don't necessarily feel conflicted about what I'm doing. Trying to cultivate an actual sense of conflict forces me to be thoughtful about what I'm doing, even if I don't, because I have to accept that I won't probably fully ever understand intergenerationally the kind of knowledge that's there, and that knowledge has also been severed for a lot of reasons. So how do you interact ethically? I don't have an answer. I know that Begesh and Begasha is a real thing in a landscape. I also know that I don't understand it, and I know that you can't just cherry pick Indigenous knowledge in that way and say, hey, this is a cool idea, I like it. It's interconnected to everything else. So uncertainty, that inner uncertainty when I travel in places I know, and an inner uncertainty when I travel to places that I'm really unfamiliar with. The only place I think is maybe an exception to that is Antarctica, because it's the only place really on Earth that has not been discovered and was actually discovered in that real way within a lifetime where collective memory is still possible.
Hello. Thank you for being here, both of you. I asked you this question earlier, but I'm gonna, because you're kind of touching on it right now, I'm gonna follow up with a little bit more. Because nature writing has a really long history of conquering the land narratives, as we all know. I found this wilderness, I beat it back, I survived the elements, I'm master of this land now. And I'm curious, during your times of writing into the wilderness, being in the wilderness, if you can speak to times where, in order to create conflict or advance your story arc, you were either tempted to use the conquering the land narrative, either upend it, or employ it, or work to intentionally upset it as a trope that has appeared historically in wilderness writing before you know?
You don't want to? I'm really curious what your perspective is on that, particularly as a scientist in the wilderness as well.
Well, it's interesting you bring that up because I approached my writing, I consider myself a scientist more than a historian or a writer. And the way I've approached this collective, what I call collective soul, or what we call collective soul, is to try to learn from people who have spent most of their lives trying to understand Native peoples. Like, for example, Richard Nelson, who wrote Make Prayers to the Raven, is my big mentor. And John and I were talking about this, and that's some of the theory where I say the collective soul of a pine marten, to me, for example, is all the nucleotides and double helix and phosphate sugar base that go back for thousands of generations. So there's a knowledge there in these wildlife species. I don't know a lot about people, the indigenous people, but I do know something about wildlife, and I wouldn't profess to say it's the same with indigenous people, but it fits really well with, in other words, if one generation, think about this, if one generation of pine marten weren't able to pass along that DNA essence, there would be no pine marten. So it's incredible how long that's gone on, and how what I call the collective soul is treating pine marten with respect. They're not individuals. You're never going to go for a walk with a pine marten and reflect on a beautiful sunset, because they're just a different level than a human is. But they still indicate, and to me, take it back to that collective soul. And there was something else that I was going to say, and I can't remember it right now. But anyway, that's about the best I could tell you. But as a scientist, I maybe look at things a little different, and I will bring a couple things up a little later about that. But, you're right. And this whole thing about, you're talking about the big W in wilderness being a more recent designation. But it's just the way, I guess, that we have looked to preserve something. It's not perfect. It's not maybe explainable sometimes, and it doesn't seem ethical. But at least when you designate wilderness areas, like I have an immense respect for Bob Marshall, who was a very big innovator and pusher in establishing wilderness areas. He established, he died young, but the Bob Marshall Wilderness was established because of him. Does anybody know what year Bob Marshall was? I mean, it's pretty recent compared to what you guys are talking about. 1941. The Forest Service used an administrative designation to designate the Bob Marshall, and then the law came in 1964. But, we're trying to bring the landscape back to the way it was. And so I think that's important to do. As I said, Richard Nelson was, to illustrate how much of a mentor he was of mine, he lived for long periods of time with the Native Alaskans, and then did an ethnological study about it and brought it to the forefront. He had a podcast called Encounters. And when the day he died, my son, who lives in Alaska, sent me an email and said, the great Richard Nelson has passed. And so I went online and started listening to things, and I didn't even know he had a podcast. He did 100 episodes and then quit. Just kind of the way he did everything, he was very successful at what he did. And so that was about 3 years ago. I'm on number 70 of my podcast right now, called Nature Journal with Flathead Valley Community College. So again, trying to see that nature as something that has more meaning to it and has more permanence. But
I think as a writer as well, the process of reflecting through the writing is really, that's an important part. When I was wanting to be a writer, I suppose, I still want to be a writer, by the way. I have this book, but it doesn't quite feel real to me. This is like I enter for a few days a different universe, and then I go back to my real life, where I am not a writer, and there's regular life, and I don't get to live within the book or that kind of semi-constructed narrative. And I think when I was younger and I really wanted to, I sought out stories and perspectives of people who traveled to a place. Paul Thoreau, the famous travel writer, talked about the importance of reading prolifically before you visit somewhere, and he justified knowing the politics of a place. He talked about that in traveling through China in the early 90s, and at least learning the basics of how to speak Chinese, reading as much as he could and understanding as much as he could about the political realities of that place, and then offering something that was a very different perspective than the kind of contemporary. I went and I I traveled on the Silk Road and I saw the Great Wall. So what's kind of behind the facade when you're traveling? And so I always tried to seek out a way of doing that when I was traveling, especially when I was younger and traveling internationally a lot. As I sat down and started writing this book, I realized that even in doing that, I still had this sense of myself of wanting to be a badass, I guess, wanting to like really prove something. The best example I have of it isn't actually in my book, but I was traveling in Malaysia and I was 23 and I went out of my way to go to Taman Negara National Park because that was the great wilderness, one of the oldest rainforests on the planet, and there are still Sumatran rhinoceroses there. There are elephants. There are all of these things that I was going to go deep enough into the jungle to see. And I got there and I was, I had my backpack, I had my stuff. I was woefully unprepared for the realities of a jungle. I was fully packed for a trip through the Bob Marshall, and I was in a tropical jungle. And made it I was about, 10 kilometers back in, and as it turned out, it was the tail end of the rainy season, and they have leeches in jungles that aren't in the water. They just hang out in places, and so like my boots, the leeches would find the top of my sock and adhere to themselves, and you'd have to stop every half mile or so and pick the leeches off. And when you'd pick them off, they have the saliva, and then so by that time, my boots were sloshing with blood, like kind of this bloody ooze that was coming down. It wasn't like I was bleeding that much. It was just leeches are gross, and I was.
Wait a minute.
And I reached this crossroads because I was on a trail and a herd of elephants had passed through recently, and I missed the trail marker that took me the way I was going to go, and pretty soon just found myself, climbing over stuff in the jungle, and I didn't know anything. I realized how stupid I was. I didn't know which spiders were poisonous and which ones were benign. I didn't know, and as it turns out, jungles, you don't see very many elephants or rhinoceros or big things. You just see a lot of bugs, and they're all very, very beautiful and very bright colored and terrifying if you don't know what they are. And about half the plants can kill you and half the plants can save your life. And if you don't know which ones are which, that's not super safe to be like rubbing against them or getting poked with thorns either. And so I just slogged through for several hours, and I was completely lost. And I finally came to a river, and I did not have a good enough map, but I could see on the map what river this was. And so I tried to ford it because as far as I could tell on the map, there was an actual trail on the other side of this that would get me back where I came. And I got out deep enough where I realized that my pack and everything was going to be soaked. And I really didn't want that. So I took my clothes off because it was, I was lost. And for some reason, I thought that was the great thing to do. And I made it to the other bank. As it turned out, the thalweg of the stream was super deep, and there was a really strong current on that side, which caught me, pulled my backpack off. I, swung downstream. I grabbed it, and I managed to drag the backpack up to a branch. And I'm hanging there, bare-assed, when a boat full of tourists comes around the bend on their guided trip, and I'm just kind of standing there hanging on to a vine that was over the river. I have no way of getting up the bank at that point, and I'm just standing there, and the boat slowed down, saw the wonderful jungle sight, and then on it went up the river, and I eventually made it up to the bank, and I made it out. And after that kind of embarrassing moment, I walked out really realizing how absolutely silly it was for me to have thought that I could just walk into a place with that kind of machismo and thinking, yeah, I'm going to go see this. I am tough enough and strong enough and can walk far enough to be able to do that. It wasn't that I couldn't. and I was able to extract myself from it. But in the end, I was only embarrassed. But it's not always smart. One should take the time to learn and to be humble. And the older I get, I think the more important it is to be humble about what you're doing, and to try and engage with humility instead of with certainty. Sorry if that was a long-winded story.
Hi, this question is for both of you. You kind of talked a little bit about it, but as far as being, coming from a white mainstream authorship and writing perspective, I'm wondering what do you feel your responsibilities are in including land acknowledgement, the indigenous populations who have inhabited these land bases that you're writing about, for generations. Creation stories, their creation stories are out of this land. And so as scientists, I think you said you referred yourself to as writers, what is your responsibility in including those indigenous perspectives, those ways of knowing, those ways of being in your writings?
I tried hard on that one. 7, 8 years ago, this would not have been the same book. I was very fortunate to get the job I had at Kenai Peninsula College and to work with Dr. Alan Boris, who worked extensively for 50 years with Dena'ina language, with Dena'ina people, to tirelessly understand both place and language, to revitalize the language. He was instrumental in the ski trails in the town where I live, the Salteshi Trails system. And he laid out the design for them. And they're all named in Dena'ina after the different animals. And I ski a lot in the winter. And one day it occurred to me that the trails were all named and laid out based, generally speaking, on the behaviors of animals, of the animals they're named after. So, the trail that is kaka, which is the word for bear, or danigi, which is the word for moose, meander through the forest as a moose would meander, travel through the forest as a bear would travel, and they're laid out in that way. They're not random, in other words. And so I try not to be random about it. I'm uncomfortable with the idea of land acknowledgement as a white person, and I spoke extensively about that and how to engage with that in my book with Sandra Shaganoff-Stewart, who's a wonderful linguist and the chair of the Alaska Native Studies program at the University of Alaska Anchorage, and a good friend. And I said, I'm a white guy. I want to be as respectful as possible. I want to call out land acknowledgements, and I want to do that with respect and humility. But I also, I'm not going to change anything with my book. Saying that we have this land acknowledgement and saying that we are on Dena'ina land it's sort of like saying, I know I stole this shit from you, but I'm not giving it back. And so how do we as white people engage with that? And one thing that she said, which I hope, I don't know, because I'm uncertain on this, is that just being willing to say that positions you as an ally, and is something that a lot of people aren't comfortable hearing, that a land acknowledgement is not enough, that it is actually, in the end, it's more important to push for practices, to push for engaging indigenous traditional ecological science with contemporary science, to look at the big picture and the small picture, to look at how do you as a system or as a structure engage things. I appreciated that with the land acknowledgement today. There was in the land acknowledgement up on the board that you included ways that the library is engaging indigenous ideology. And I think that's important. Did I get it right in here? Probably not. But it is important. And I think it's important to listen, most of all. I think that's the best thing that I can do as a white guy.
I think it's really difficult to write a book or books about the landscape and try to understand the native culture that was there many, many, many thousands of years before you were there. And in my career with Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, I worked with the Salish Kootenai tribes for 35, 40 years. And my one of my good friends, who was my counterpart with the tribes, whenever the subject would come up, generally, he would say something like, "Don't speak for others, let us speak for ourselves," which is what they've really done. If you look at all the literature now that Salish Kootenai put out, the signage, the bull trout brochures, everything they put out from their own perspective. So as someone from my culture, I'm just writing from my culture. I can't do any more than that. And, I think there's still a lot of knowledge to be learned. And a little later here, I'll get into some of the bull trout and cutthroat. It doesn't matter really what culture you have to recognize them and to see how they're such an important part of the landscape. That's about all I could say on that.
Will you talk about the trout?
Now?
Yeah.
So anyway, can everybody hear me? Okay. Well, anyway, I didn't know about we were going to do any readings or anything, but I do have one little reading about the trout that I'll get into here in a minute. Sorry about that. Basically, I have spent a lot of my career studying cutthroat trout and bull trout in the wilderness. And I really have come upon some pretty unusual things when it came to especially cutthroat trout. And how old do you think an old cutthroat trout in the upper South Fork of the Flathead is? How old would you think it would be? That's really old. Usually cutthroat trout are only, they only live to 5 or 6 years old. And so it's quite a life for them up there, and it's a very difficult life for them. So there was a period of time when I hiked the 24 miles, usually in one day, into the headwaters of the South Fork, and then I would sample 100 cutthroat trout, take scale samples and lengths and weights, and I put tags in a lot of them, and then taking fish, little clips, so I could see if they were pure genetic West Slope cutthroat. So it was sort of my passion. And I remember one of my supervisors said, "Oh, that's Fraley, that's over monitoring." Well, he was wrong, because unless you follow a population 12, 14 years, there's these variations that you wouldn't have never seen. And you can think of lots of examples of that. And what I did find was something about the age of cutthroat that was pretty stunning. And so I'll read it to you. Most tag cutthroat never show up again, especially in a year or more later. Their lifespans are short due to the many mortality threats they face: hungry bull trout, ice in the winter, and so on. Overall, I recaptured only 2.7% of the fish I tagged. So in other words, I handled like 1,300 cutthroat and tagged about, with numbered tags, tagged about 600, 700 of them. And so I go back in and, occasionally you would catch ones that you know it's the fish because you already tagged it. So the first time I caught IRO 5677, which is the tag number, in 1988, it didn't occur to me that I might see him again. And since regulations prohibited keeping fish over 12 inches in length, I figured anglers probably wouldn't turn in the fish. But a couple years later, on August 9th, 1990, at the headwaters of the South Fork, I looked into the eyes of IRO 5677 again. So I handled this fish again, which is almost never done. I mean, in all the challenges they have to survive, and I'm going way into the wilderness, and he's still in the same area. In the 2 years since I've first seen him, and I know it's a him because of his kype jaw, he'd grown 1 inch to 16.1 inches. How lucky I was to catch him again and document the average growth rate about 0.5 inches per year, typical of older fish. It was great to see IR 05677 again, and I bade him farewell as I released him into the stream. At that time, I had no idea that I'd see him yet again years later. And you know what my editor at Far Country, terrific editor, Will Harmon, he said, John, you know, I'll let this go on for a while, but you're starting to talk to Cutthroat now in the manuscript. He said, I don't know if that's smart. So I tagged him in 88, caught him again in 92. So in 1994, he was the first fish I caught that afternoon. 3 times over a span of 6 years, so unlikely, so mind-blowing. His eyes gave no hint of recognition or concern. Maybe he was used to it by then. And then a little more, another cutthroat, IR 8159, also had an interesting story. It goes on. Basically, I caught her again. She had grown to 15 inches. And then again, knew she was 9 years old. And I had caught her 3 years in a row, the same fish. And you would never know any of this if you just went in and sampled 1 year or 2 years at the headwaters. So I think that's pretty incredible. And I think there's a spiritual side to that too. I mean, just think about, and it's not just the 14 years I did it. We're talking thousands of years, thousands of generations that these fish have been in that same place. They test pure cutthroat now, and this dance has been going on for thousands and thousands of years, and it's just humbling, really, to think about it. Well, people like just write off cutthroat or whatever, but to me it's like a stalwart beacon about the wilderness. And it was really an honor to be able to see these fish and be able to take part in something like that, because it's just so unlikely you would catch a fish like that over and over again. We learned so much about them. Anyway, that's where the scientist came out of me.
John, I wanted to ask you, as a scientist, what is your approach for balancing science with the spiritual experiences or the spiritual connection you've had with nature? And is any of that informed by some of the people you've worked with, Doris Huffnine, Bud Moore, Henry Full, or Richard Nelson?
Well, Bud Moore is the last chapter in this book, My Wilderness Life. And how many of you know, anybody know Bud Moore in here? He's a very famous naturalist that lives down the Swan. And he has moved the Forest Service more and more towards natural, like he was the fire chief in Washington, D.C. Here's a guy that didn't have a college degree. He got a honorary doctorate degree from the University of Montana, and you can go see his brick over there. He was the kind of person that was just incredibly talented, and people recognized it. But he was a great conservationist. Most people, he got the Forest Service going on ecosystem management and a lot of smart things, like, for example, saying, if you don't know, don't go slow. Don't tinker with things. To me, he's one of the greatest naturalists since Leopold. But at any rate, he was a big part of my mentorship. The people that mentored me. What was your question again?
What's your approach to balancing science and the spirituality?
Yeah. Well, Bud was pretty good at that. He would go in when he was, what his wife Janet said, pushing 70. He was 67, and I'm 69, and I'm already past a lot of the things that Bud already could do. I couldn't do it anymore. But he stayed in the wilderness for 3 months just to experience it, and did some pine marten trapping in the upper South Fork in Little Salmon Creek. In fact, if you go down to the headwaters of the South Fork, I don't know if you've ever been in there, and you walk up Danaher Creek a little bit, there was a sign that had a description or a short description of a battle that took place. I assume it was between the Salish Kootenai and the Blackfeet, but I'm not positive. And so that kind of reminds you of how far back that goes. But I think that the other thing I want to talk about a little later is the different sort of spooky things I've run into that inform that, what you just said. I'm going to...
Would you like to tell us about the
Now? Okay, well, a few things. I could go on forever on this, couldn't I, Heather? So when I started doing all the characters that are in these books, the Doris sort of steered me to them. She said, you got to talk to Tiny Powell. He was a packer when Josephine Duty was. Anybody heard of Josephine Duty, the bootleg lady of Glacier Park? That was one of my characters. And so was George Snyder, who was the original owner of the Glacier Park Lodge. And so Doris steered me into all these people to interview so I could do this an initial article on Josephine Duty in 1989, right before she died. In fact, she was editing my manuscript on her deathbed at the Brendan House in Kalispell. And Doris told me all about Josephine, and who was an actual bootlegger. And she also told me about Snyder. Now, I don't know how many of you know about George Snyder being the original owner of the what is now the DeSmet boat. He called it can't remember what he called it now. But at any rate, he actually lived with Doris up the Middle Fork, lived in a cabin near Doris. And so after the Park Service finally booted him out, there's a big story in one of my books about it. And she put it this way. She said, you can't really judge people the way others do. Other people told Dan and Doris, Dan was a ranger, that Snyder was a piker, whatever that was, and that he would cheat you. Because he had gotten $1,500 from the Park Service because he sued and beat the Park Service, who took one of his boats out of McDonald Lake without asking him. It was hilarious. And but at any rate, so he was living on that money, and then he moved into Kalispell to work for the Works Progress Administration, and he got hurt there, and no one really knows. You can't find in Glacier what happened to him, so I'm going to give you my journey here. So, and I asked my great aunt Doris before she passed, well, what happened to Snyder? What happened to him? Oh, I really don't know, she said. Well, I found out she was lying to me. I traced George Snyder's life down, and how many of you have heard of Ace Powell, the artist Ace Powell? Okay, he did some interviews with the National Park Service in Glacier, old interviews, and there was one little spot in there where it said that George Snyder went to an insane asylum. And so I thought, well, what's the insane asylum in Montana? Warm Springs, right? So I called Warm Springs, and no, we don't have a George Snyder. And then they called back and said, yes, we did have a George Snyder. He was really a big part of our little community in the 40s. And then he was actually here and then passed away. I can't remember what the year was. And so I'm doing this piece on Snyder. It turned out to be like 20,000 word chapter. And so they said, we don't have his file. So they looked around a little more, and then the guy called me again and said, his file is at the Montana Historical Society. So I called the Historical Society. I expected there wouldn't be much in it, and they sent me this file, a copy of this file, pretty thick. First page showed how it said, George Snyder, an insane patient. This is the guy that owned the McDonald Lodge. And then the next page was, he was interred because he had sloppy personal habits. Now, I've always kidded, my kids could have interred me if that was what got you into an insane asylum. And so all you needed is a nurse, a doctor, and one witness, and you're in, So he got in it. And so the next page I turn over, hey, that letterhead is my great aunt and great uncle Doris Huffine, Dan Doris Huffine, the logo for their Stanton Creek Lodge. So the third, this had not been opened for 60 years. This file was sealed. And I opened it up, and here's Doris told me she didn't even know what happened to him. Well, here's this letter where she wrote to Warm Springs and said, what can I get, George? I visited him yesterday or whatever it was, all the way from up in the Flathead. So she lied to me about that. And but I thought that was sort of a spiritual thing where I'm looking at a folder that was 60 years old that came from the Montana Historical Society, and there's a letter from my great aunt Doris. So that's one other example. I'll give you just one more right now. So up the Middle Fork, were you aware that there's a mass grave? And probably a lot of the people in that mass grave were Asian people that worked on the railroad. Well, I looked into it and talked to the Robertsons who lived up there for many years back into the 1800s, and I was putting this story together. It's in my book, Rangers, Trappers, and Trailblazers. It gets bad when you can't remember your book title. Have you ever done that? Well, you're so simple. See, you're smart. Compass lines. Although I kept calling it compass points. So anyway, we researched it, found this water main that they had built out of wooden pipe, and some of the old timers showed me where the train was and where it crashed and killed all these people. And we eventually put up a plaque. My daughter actually designed the plaque, and right along the tracks where it happened, because nobody knows anything about it. It happened in 1901, you know. And so one of the packers, Cork Hill, who lives up the Middle Fork, actually packed for us on one trip in the Bob. He is now haunted by this. He claims he saw like an orb in his living room. His dog was barking at it, and the poor guy. and you know, so it's just another example of spiritualism being, I think it's real. I mean, to me, if it lives in your heart, it lives. And I just think there's more reality to spiritual things than we think there are.
So we have about 15 minutes left. Just want to make sure if you have a question, raise your hand, and I'll pass the mic to you.
I love the fact that there's multiple generations on the podium. I really, really love that because there's a different perspective, and there's awareness of history, and there's awareness of indigenous culture. I'm sorry I walked in late, but I really got a lot out of what both of you said. Could you talk a little bit about how our connection to the land and the outdoors from a cross-generational perspective is starting to change? I feel there's a revival in awareness of how important the natural world is. Can you talk a little bit about that and how you've made your own discoveries in your own work, both of you? And I'm going to start with the young man to the right, and then the young man to the left.
Yeah, can I just read something? Is that okay? So this comes about, well, I'll just read it because I think I introduce it here as well. So in 2018, I took a graduate research course on traditional ecological knowledge and wrote my term paper about the local Kanaitze tribe's efforts to establish a Dena'ina garden for elders. In that process, I interviewed several elders, and I interviewed a friend of mine who is instrumental in language revitalization products and a culture bearer. He's my age for the tribe as well, Joel Isaac. He's also a sculptor and a pretty incredible person, and he's worked across generations, particularly with Dena'ina elder Helen Dick, who's one of the last speakers of the not the inner Cook Inlet dialect, but the outer Cook Inlet dialect of Dena'ina. Doing a huge amount of language revitalization. Helen Dick actually just was given an honorary doctorate from UAF for her work in that field. And so the idea behind the Kanaitze's garden was to cultivate traditional wild plants in raised garden beds on the tribal campus so that elders could still practice their harvesting, practice harvesting. Traditional plant knowledge then isn't just something that happened in the woods a long time ago, but a living practice that can adapt to new contexts and to modern realities. So for my paper, I interviewed Joel, and the first thing he told me was that the value of wild food extends well beyond the dinner table. When you think about plants as part of an interconnected world, to harvest and eat them means that you receive medicine, exercise, fresh air, and community. The traditional Dena'ina practices that surround wild food harvests, said Isaac, serve as protection from dangerous psychological influence, isolation, disconnection, sequestration, and in this way, gathering becomes ceremony, an all-encompassing experience that plays across seasons, decades, and millennia. So getting our hands in the dirt is a gift, a heart line into the land that anchors us to bedrock. And perhaps it's not so important how much we gather or how many jars we produce, but that we find ways to connect. In other words, the weeds in our gardens have as much value as the plants we cultivate if only we're willing to accept the disorder. If only we're willing, the work of loving a place can teach us the best ways to love ourselves. And I think that idea of holistic interaction with place is something that is part of the cultural revitalization that we see. We're seeing it significantly in Indigenous communities across the country, and I think my generation differs from an older generation because, in part, in that connection to place because of the revitalization that's happened in Indigenous communities. As atonement happens, as decolonizing practices do start to take effect, we see that support. You see the old biases and hatreds erode. They don't stand up to scrutiny anymore. The beliefs, the inborn beliefs that get passed down from white generation to white generation about Native people, the racist ideas, are crumbling. And that's a wonderful, wonderful thing. And as such, I think you're also seeing a connection across generations in Indigenous communities. And I think you're seeing that connection start to happen across cultural communities as well. So you're starting to see land managing agencies actually and meaningfully interact with Indigenous cultures in new ways. That's a really wonderful thing. The Board of Game in Alaska still has a ways to go. So does the Board of Fish. They could do with a biologist on one of them at least. But that's just my opinion. I feel like the Board of Fish and Game should probably have a biologist on it. They don't. But you're also seeing that happen. You're seeing that happen not just with land acknowledgements at the start of business meetings, but you're seeing that happen meaningfully within community, and that's a positive thing, and something that my parents' generation, my grandparents' generation, I don't think it would have been possible. In my parents' generation, Indigenous people were still getting sent to boarding schools, and in my generation, we are seeing in a very, very public way, not as much in the U.S., but at a state level and in Canada and on an international stage, we're seeing efforts to heal and acknowledge some of the past trauma that was inflicted. As that trauma gets acknowledged, it changes the way we interact with place. Because it's all of North America is Indigenous land, and we're not going anywhere soon. No one's saying we should leave. And so I think that's one of the wonderful things about John's book is the connection between science and spirituality is something that exists and has always existed in different contexts, but we're able to think about it and draw connections between some of what you're saying here and some of what is being said in public ways that wasn't always possible for marginalized communities. So that's huge. I hope that answers it.
My answer won't be nearly that good. But I think, again, similar to what I was mentioning, and I like what he's saying, is, as I said, I work with the Sayos Kootenai tribes for 35 years at least. And one of the things we really focused on a lot, and if you look at their outreach information now, they've come huge distances in honoring bull trout and learning about bull trout, and it's a very important species to them. And I think it's important that they take the lead in that. But it's also important that we've been able to monitor these species so they know how many, we all know how many there are, where they're using, what areas they're using, and know how to conserve them. And I just wanted to mention one little story, if I can. How much time do we have? Okay. A bull trout nest is called a red. And they build that nest all through the upper area of the Flathead, for example, and other drainages. Of course, where do the bull trout come from that spawn in the upper South Fork, though? They don't come from Flathead Lake. Where do they come from? Hungry Horse Reservoir. It's been cut off from the natural system. And so they have their own kind of, and so for 40 years of my life, 42 years of my life, and I'll be counting bull trout reds again before the end, right around the end of September. I have counted the bull trout reds in Granite Creek, one particular creek, as well as others. Even after I switched jobs in Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, I kept counting as a volunteer. And I often did it alone and tried to interact with them. I just want to read this little thing just for fun. So I only really had two significant close-ups in terms of bear scare. I had one while counting bull trout reds over the years in Coal Creek, also in the Middle Fork of the drainage, during the mid-1980s. I was trekking down the trail towards the river in this lonely drainage after I'd finished counting reds. I'd surveyed all the way upstream about 7 miles to Elk Creek, near the Fielding Trail Junction, a stunning spot below Cloudcraft Peaks and Mount Duty. I'd only found 3 reds, and I kept trying to get my friend, he's a Ponderay actually, would try to kind of get him to go with me, but on this one he wasn't with me. Only 2 miles short of getting out, I hurried around a sharp turn in a trail that cut through the heavy timber, and right ahead of me stood a massive, dark-colored grizzly bear, almost black, not 20 yards away. He looked at me, I looked at him, he dropped down, spun, and dashed down the trail in the opposite direction. When he ran, it sounded like a huge cow galloping and thundering along. I mean, you wouldn't believe what it sounded like at that close. I couldn't believe how fast he could run for such a big animal. I was glad that the bulky grizzly ran in the opposite direction, but as I reached his tracks on the torn-up trail, I realized I had to follow along in his path to reach the river, to reach the Middle Fork and cross the tracks and get up the other side. I walked warily ahead, and sure enough, his tracks showed that he had just stayed on the trail. I had visions of him waiting for me up ahead, ready to pounce. Luckily, I came to an abrupt switchback, and at that point, I dove down through the timber, heading straight for the Middle Fork at top speed. I reached the river and crossed, then hiked up the other side across the railroad tracks, and breathing easier, I had promised myself, this would scare you, right? So I had promised myself I would stop doing bull trout red surveys alone, especially in these remote areas. That promise lasted about a week because I love to do it. And it just kind of reminds me of an encounter that I had a Blackfeet roommate when I was going to school at MSU. And he's now the chief of wildlife for the Blackfeet tribes. And I remember him telling me how that when they saw a grizzly like that, they would talk to them. So I started thinking maybe I could talk to him, but nope, you don't have those skills.
We have time for one more question. Does anyone in the audience have a question? All right, that's okay. I've got one. Okay.
My question's more just about writing. When did you start writing? Were you always writers growing up, or how did you come to that?
I think so. My undergrad, I started out, and I really wanted to be a journalist. My first summer job, I have an uncle who worked at the Miami Herald. And so I got to go down and spend a summer as an intern working for a newspaper. And if anyone knows much about Miami, it's a cool newspaper to work for, especially in the late 90s. It was, to be 16 years old and working in downtown Miami with whatever strange, weird corruption and just zonkers, bizarre Florida man stuff going on down there. It was an eye-opening experience, and I was like, this is what journalism is. This is what it can be. This is awesome. Like, I got to help cover a story about sacrificed goat heads washing up in Sly Stallone's front yard. This is amazing. It doesn't get better than this. And then I went to real journalism school, and it was not as awesome because it's a slog. And I found that I was actually more interested in story. I was more interested in the anecdotes than I was in conveying the news in a format. And so I switched to English. I didn't really know what I was going to do with that. I figured I'd be a barista, and then that was going to be fine. But then I got into, then I wanted to travel. I wanted to see the world. I had a love of wilderness. I got into trail building. I built trails around the West for a number of years. Through that, I got into fire. So I started just looking for seasonal jobs and traveled for basically 5 years and keeping a journal there. I realized that from the idea of loving books and loving reading and loving writing and loving stories, that I could tell my own stories, and that's something I really wanted to do. So eventually I went to grad school for it and wrote what I thought would be a collection of travel writing because that was where my love was, and that's what part of what this is started as that graduate project going back 12, 13 years now, and it evolved a lot. You know, what I was writing then and how I was writing was very much I wanted to be the traveler. I read travel narratives when I went and visited places, and then I had a family. And I don't know that I would have successfully published this book if I hadn't become a dad. So I think the thing that helps me remember that I am a writer and that I have a responsibility to writing isn't so much what's in the page as it is that I have to be like honest with myself and following the thing that I love for my kids. And that's kind of a scary space to be in because it asks me to think about what I write and how I write, and even, you know, the way I engage with writing in new ways. You know, you don't get large blocks of time to do this kind of work when you have toddlers around, and so it's an ongoing process, that act of accepting that I write and that's what I do. But also, I think it's important to be thoughtful. Right, I want something that when my kids read this in 15 years, hopefully a little less than that, or maybe not at all, that they don't go, "Wow, that's dated." They say, "Wow, that's someone who's thoughtful." I'm glad that my dad was thinking about that when I was an infant because it's important, and rather than just telling stories about all of the cool places I gallivanted around to.
Do I have a couple minutes? Yeah, you have a couple. Okay. So are you a writer? Do you want to be a writer?
I think it's like one of those, like, what you would call a crazy train. Like, I sometimes joke when I find a nice place to write, I'm like, this is going to inspire the next grade here.
Well, I could tell you want to write. And in my opinion, I don't know what you think, John, you're an actual journalist. My daughter has the same master's degree in journalism. I think writers yearn to tell people about things. You just want to tell people about things. You know, you just want to do that. And I can kind of see that coming into you. And in my opinion, everybody's got a book in him or in her. And because the way I put it with my stuff is, I know things that only I know. In other words, your experiences and background, only you know it. So you're the expert. You're an expert on whatever you want to write about. And, you know, read Stephen King's book on writing. He has the last section is all the mechanics of writing and how to write. And the main thing he says, the thing that grabbed me was, write every day. Every day you should write. And don't put it off. And eventually, there's no way I would have written my books if I would have not done that. Almost every day, at least do some research, do some writing, and and the great advantage I had is I met Great Aunt Doris, and Doris told me these stories about the park, and I thought, oh, I got to tell people, this is incredible. Even that first day when we argued and when I complained about the bears, I thought this woman's cooked for the Going to Sun Road. She's spent a winter at Cut Bank Ranger Station, and I got to tell people about it. And then she led me through these old timers, which kind of kept expanding, and that's the way it happened. So, you better get going. You need to catch up.
It's hard. Like, don't kid yourself. It is like writing every day for sure, but that's not always easy. And they're not all like great days. It's not always an enjoyable thing. Stephen King's book is fantastic because he says that, right? It's not always that much fun. It is not necessarily like the most enviable life. And it's a lot of time alone. It's a lot of time with doubt because, until you have a stack of books like that, sitting down to write, and even if you have a stack of books like that, is something that it feels easy to put off. Like, I should be cleaning the toilet. I could be going on a hike or a bike ride. I should be. You're not getting paid to sit there, at least not up front. So there's risk. It's definitely a gamble, but there's reward.
One last thing, Richard Nelson, who's a mentor of both of us, he at the end of his life, he said, "I'm done writing. So I'll never write again," because he had to have his arms like propped up with, I think, with prostheses to, and he didn't make any money all his life, and yet he's a very famous nature writer. But it's a B. Yeah.
I just wanted to give a quick thank you to everyone for coming to this session today, and a big thank you to John and John for talking to us about their work. Just so you know, there is a fact and fiction table right outside the Cooper rooms where you can pick up My Wilderness Life and Compass Lines. They are great reads. I highly encourage you. And once again, thank you for coming to the first day of the festival. Hope to see your faces over the weekend.